Sunday, we continue our journey through the book of Acts and stories of the early church and turn now to the 20th chapter of Acts. On the first day of the week, when we met to break bread, Paul was holding a discussion with them, and since he intended to leave the next day, he continued speaking until midnight. Now, there were many lamps in the room upstairs where we were meeting. A young man named Eutychus, who was sitting in the window, began to sink off into a deep sleep while Paul talked still longer. Overcome by sleep, Eutychus fell to the ground 3 floors below and was picked up dead. But Paul went down and bending over, took him in his arms and said, "Do not be alarmed, for his life is in him." Then Paul went upstairs, and after he had broken bread and eaten, he continued to converse with them until dawn. Then he left. Meanwhile, they had taken the boy away alive and were not a little comforted. This is the word of the Lord. Several years ago now, in a column titled "The Power of Posterity," the writer David Brooks imagined a world with no future. What would happen if those of us living today learned that we were the final generation? The effects, of course, predictably would be devastating. Brooks writes, "Without posterity, there are no grand designs. There are no high ambitions. Even words like justice lose meaning because everything gets reduced to the narrow qualities of the here and now." Brooks draws this conclusion: anything worth doing is the work of generations. Just before his own death, I heard the great preacher Fred Craddock, then in his mid-80s, proclaim that of all the great heroes of history, the person he admired most was the cathedral worker. He said many of the great cathedrals, of course, took over a century to build, and in his sermon, Craddock imagined the mason cutting the rock for the cornerstone of a massive building that he would never see completed in his own lifetime. These wise people trusted that their great-grandchildren would worship one day in the cathedral that they began. There's the faith of our mothers and fathers was a faith that looked forward, that boldly envisioned a bright future for the church they loved. Today, that future feels threatened. It is simply a reality that millennials, those born since 1982, are leaving church and other religious communities, and unlike their parents and grandparents, they aren't coming back. The reasons are varied, but there are common threads. There is the perception of the church as stifling, fear-based, or antagonistic. There are messages that feel shallow, manipulative, or lacking in substance. There's the lack of a strong feeling of connection with others who attend church. There's the lack of engagement with the challenging issues or the deep questions of our time. Now, I was born in September of that pivotal year. I'm aware of how my profession puzzles my peers. I remember the curiosity and confusion that came from friends in college when I shared that my next step was that I was going to seminary. They were happy for me in a polite, isn't that nice kind of way. Deeper down, though, there was suspicion. For like many in our generation, they had grown up with no significant religious engagement, perhaps church on Christmas and Easter or synagogue at Passover, but other than that, very little. They were caring, compassionate, kind, thoughtful people who didn't need a faith community to make them moral. The institutional church was not so much the object of their ire as it was the relic of another era, a kind of fossil left behind from the days of our great-grandparents. For many of us raised on Nickelodeon, Nintendo, and Ninja Turtles, the church missed the opportunity or lacked the credibility to captivate us. In this brief account of a youth named Eutychus in the book of Acts, we find, I think, a first-century analog to the experience of many people in our churches. You see, Paul has been preaching since just before noon, and it is now midnight. That's right, a 12-hour sermon. For those of you inclined to grumble after a measly 25 minutes. Eutychus, whose name translates good fortune, we'll call him, for irony's sake, lucky, is precariously perched in a windowsill on the third floor of the building. And it's getting late. The boy has reached the limits of his attention span. I think the author of Acts is smirking as he writes the next phrase. Eutychus began to sink off into a deep sleep while Paul talked still longer. Finally, Eutychus falls asleep, falls out the window, falls to his death, or so we thought. But a miracle takes place. Paul interrupts his sermon. That's the miracle. He takes a break from proclamation to go downstairs and take the young man in his arms. It's a tender moment, as the book of Acts describes it. Paul says there is life still in him. He pauses to engage Eutychus, reviving the life that is still within. It's an odd story. It's an amusing story. Here, tucked away in the accounts of Paul's preaching journeys in Acts, I wonder how many of you have heard a sermon on Eutychus. But if we look again, we might find a lesson for the cathedral builders of our time and some hope for the future of faith. There's a giveaway clue in the opening phrase of the passage, on the first day of the week. In the book of Acts, this is more than a marker on the calendar. It's an allusion to another event that took place on the first day of the week. It takes us all the way back to Easter morning when a group of women discovered an empty tomb, a risen Lord ahead of them, a God alive in the world. The first day of the week is the day of resurrection. And this is a resurrection story. A description of what happens every time the church gathers to worship God. As my mentor, Will Willimon, writes, there is something about this God that just loves to wake people up, to shake people up, to raise people up. You see, nothing less than resurrection is the mission of the church. It happens when the disciples of Jesus Christ refuse to stay in the tombs of past glory or catacombs of like-minded isolation and choose instead to follow the Spirit of God always ahead of us, always ahead of us. It happens, resurrection, it happens when faith looks forward. If we fail at that task, if the church forsakes the future, we will be, in Brooks' haunting words, reduced to the narrow qualities of the here and now. We will preserve what we have. We will myopically focus on ourselves. We might even marvel at the beauty and stability of what we have received, while neglecting our responsibility to those who follow us. A few weeks ago, an envelope appeared in my mail slot at the church with a note card and this faded sermon manuscript. This sermon was preached by the Reverend Mac Wells on June 26th, 1977. The title of the sermon is, "What Do These Stones Mean?" It's an allusion to the beauty of this space, but also a reference to words that Joshua spoke to people on the verge of the promised land. Joshua said to God's people gathered there, in the future, when your descendants ask their parents, "What do these stones mean?" tell them that Israel crossed the Jordan on dry ground. Tell them that the Lord your God dried up the Jordan before you until you had crossed over. Tell them how God redeemed you with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Tell them the mighty deeds of God. Mac Wells closed his sermon that morning with the words of another of Second's pastors, Bill Hudnut, words that were written in 1963. It was the occasion of the church's 125th anniversary, and it was Hudnut's first year as senior pastor. As I read the words, they seemed providentially potent for the spring of 2021. Listen. The well of the past becomes useful to us as we dip into it, only if the waters from which we drink refresh us on our journey into the future's broadening way. A church with more tradition than vision is dying. The justification for looking backward is not self-glorification, but rather the erection of a platform from which we can spring into the dawn of a new day. Our work is not finished. It never will be. We have not already attained, but we know where we stand. Bill Hudnut's words call us to faith that boldly looks forward. The words ask us to be a church that knows and appreciates what has been, and they compel us to cast a vision for what God intends to do with and through us right now. And so as 21st century peers of Eutychus fall out of windows throughout the American religious landscape, we owe it to them. We owe it to our God, our children, and generations yet unborn to articulate and embody a faith for the future. When we do, we honor the best of who we've always been. And we shine the light on the path ahead, a light that only God's people can shine. What do these stones mean? What does it look like for us here and now? Is there still life in this old body? I want to suggest that vibrant, forward-looking faith for our time offers a compelling theology of transcendent truth, a clear call to seek the unity of the church, and an unwavering commitment to pursue justice, love mercy, and serve with humility. Briefly, let's explore those three. A compelling theology of transcendent truth. It should not, I think, be lost on us that this morning's story takes place in the context of worship. You see, Eutychus may be dozing off, but he's in the right place for divine encounters nonetheless. Worship of God is the central act of Christian community because it places us in a context larger and more significant than ourselves. Many millennials are skeptical of a culture that has no place for transcendence. We've seen the limits of narcissistic coddling or endless acquisitiveness in search of elusive meaning. We're ready to hear that the world does not revolve around us. The experience of Eutychus, who was raised from the dead in the middle of a worship service, feels like a hopeful possibility. Perhaps we too can be awakened from the unquestioned drive toward more of everything with no attention to what it's all for or why we're here in the first place. And so a faith that looks forward must first look up, turning our vision to the one who offers abundant life, not empty abundance. Tragically, I find that what is missing in many appeals from churches today is God. Out of embarrassment, uncertainty, or both, we are neglecting the core of our message that there is a God who has made this world a place of divine encounter, whose grace is a gift beyond human comprehension, whose love can transform your life, whose will grants purpose and possibility. And let us be clear, without this truth, nothing else we say or do will carry the weight of faith forward. A clear call to seek the unity of the church. And unless this transcendence turns us toward one another in grace, our churches will simply reflect the toxic division of the world, or worse, become mere clubs for like-minded individuals to gather around their self-righteousness. Eutychus and his friends, I can promise you, will see through such transparently shallow messages that reduce the gospel to a bumper sticker. We all know by now how entrenched and polarized partisans are responding to the most challenging issues we face. What is missing, I think, is a theologically informed and spiritually shaped vision for our divided time. One that is not about scoring points, slamming other perspectives, owning the other side, or silencing voices of dissent. In here, we must be about something different than that. In here, we ask how Christ calls us to shape the world and live together. And doing so must always mean transcending easy divisions between conservative and liberal, traditional and contemporary, Bible-believing and social justice-seeking. Accomplishing the great purposes of the church must lead us beyond such simplistic and dualistic thinking and into authentic, complex community that leaves space for listening. A commitment to seek justice, love mercy, and serve with humility. I'm wholly convinced that the future of the church depends on communities of Christians deeply committed to the world that God created and longs to redeem. That our future depends on churches that guide us to Christ-centered and selfless lives, to contribute to the shalom of our neighbors because of our faith, to see the world through the gospel lens of justice, mercy, and humility. What does God require of us? If the church is a collection of know-it-all answer givers, intent on telling everyone else how to live while ignoring our basic call to neighborliness, we've forsaken our mission. Our commitment to pursue justice, to feed the hungry, to welcome the stranger, to advocate for the oppressed, to honor all people, it must be grounded in God's word to us. The time is right, I think, to open our eyes to the suffering in our midst, to use our voice to name it, to roll up our sleeves and do something about it. For we are servants of a servant Lord. 58 years ago, Bill Hudnut perceived a moment of possibility for this great church. He did so in the context of deep political division, wide spiritual seeking, major movements of societal change, and a pervading ethos of uncertainty about the future. In such a time as this, he imagined the construction of a platform built on the solid foundation of the past from which Second Church could spring into the promise of a new day. And I don't have to tell you that what followed was an awakening, an era of growth and vitality, influence and impact, leadership and service. The church had an awakening. And by God's grace, what has happened before can happen again. So let us ask in the future, when our descendants ask their parents the meaning of these stones, what will our answer be? Will we only look back in self-glorification of storied tradition, or will we point to this our time as God's people in this place as a moment of awakening that renewed the purpose of our church? In the months to come, I'll be sharing more of my hope that we might claim this time and proclaim God's call to transcendence and unity, to justice and mercy, to humble service and leadership. But for now, I simply promise you this, that God's still at it, shaking us up, raising us up, calling us into the promise of a new day. So prepare your hearts and gather up your strength. It's time to wake up. Amen.